双语音标领航，注音阅读启蒙，叶兴阳有声读物。
Active Service by Stephen Crane. Chapter 1. Marjorie walked pensively along the hall. In the cool shadows made by the palms on the window ledge, her face wore the expression of thoughtful melancholy expected on the faces of the devotees who pace in cloistered gloom. She halted before a door at the end of the hall and laid her hand on the knob. She stood hesitating, her head bowed. It was evident that this mission was to require great fortitude. At last she opened the door. "Father," she began at once. There was disclosed an elderly, narrow-faced man seated at a large table and surrounded by manuscripts and books. The sunlight flowing through curtains of turkey red fell sanguinely upon the bust of dead-eyed Pericles on the mantel. A little clock was ticking, hidden somewhere among the countless leaves of writing, the maps and broad heavy tomes that swarmed upon the table. Her father looked up quickly with an ogreish scowl. "Go away," he cried in a rage. "Go away. Go away. Get out." He seemed on the point of arising to eject the visitor. It was plain to her that he had been interrupted in the writing of one of his sentences, ponderous, solemn, and endless, in which wandered multitudes of homeless and friendless prepositions, adjectives looking for a parent, and quarreling nouns, sentences which no longer symbolized the language form of thought, but which had about them a quaint aroma from the dens of long-dead scholars. "Get out," snarled the professor. "Father," faltered the girl, either because his formulated thought was now completely knocked out of his mind by his own emphasis in defending it, or because he detected something of portent in her expression. His manner suddenly changed, and with a petulant glance at his writing he laid down his pen and sank back in his chair to listen. "Well, what is it, my child?" The girl took a chair near the window and gazed out upon the snow-stricken campus, where at the moment a group of students returning from a classroom were festively hurling snowballs. "I've got something important to tell you, Father," said she, "but I don't quite know how to say it." "Something important?" repeated the professor. He was not habitually interested in the affairs of his family, but this proclamation that something important could be connected with them filled his mind with a capricious interest. "Well, what is it, Marjorie?" she replied calmly. "Rufus Coleman wants to marry me." "What?" demanded the professor loudly. "Rufus Coleman. What do you mean?" The girl glanced furtively at him. She did not seem to be able to frame a suitable sentence. As for the professor, he had, like all men both thoughtless and thoughtful, told himself that one day his daughter would come to him with a tale of this kind. He had never forgotten that the little girl was to be a woman, and he had never forgotten that this tall, lithe creature, the present Marjorie, was a woman. He had been entranced and confident, or entranced and apprehensive according to the time. A man focused upon astronomy, the pig market, or social progression, may nevertheless have a secondary mind which hovers like a spirit over his dahlia tubers and dreams upon the mystery of their slow and tender revelations. The professor's secondary mind had dwelt always with his daughter and watched with a faith and delight the changing to a woman of a certain fat and mumbling babe. However, he now saw this machine, this self-sustaining, self-operative love, which had run with the ease of a clock, suddenly crumble to ashes and leave the mind of a great scholar staring at a calamity. "Rufus Coleman," he repeated, stunned. Here was his daughter, very obviously desirous of marrying Rufus Coleman. "Marjorie," he cried in amazement and fear, "what possesses you marry Rufus Coleman?" The girl seemed to feel a strong sense of relief at his prompt recognition of a fact. Being freed from the necessity of making a flat declaration, she simply hung her head and blushed impressively. A hush fell upon them. The professor stared long at his daughter. The shadow of unhappiness deepened upon his face. "Marjorie."
"Marjorie," he murmured at last.
He had tramped heroically upon his panic and devoted his strength to bringing thought into some kind of attitude toward this terrible fact. I am surprised," he began, fixing her then with a stern eye. he asked. Why do you wish to marry this man? You, with your opportunities of meeting persons of intelligence. And you want to marry? His voice grew tragic. You want to marry the Sunday editor of the New York Eclipse. It is not so very terrible,
Is it?
said Marjorie sullenly. Wait a moment,
Don't talk.
cried the professor. He arose and walked nervously to and fro, his hands flying in the air. He was very red behind the ears, as when in the classroom some student offended him. A gambler, a sporter of fine clothes, an expert on champagne, a polite loafer, a witness knave who edits the Sunday edition of a great outrage upon our sensibilities. You want to marry him? This man?
Marjorie.
You are insane. This fraud who asserts that his work is intelligent. This fool comes here to my house and... He became aware that his daughter was regarding him coldly. I thought we had best have all this part of it over at once, she remarked. He confronted her in a new kind of surprise. The little keen-eyed professor was at this time imperial, on the verge of a majestic outburst. Be still,
He said.
don't be clever with your father. Don't be a dodger.
Or,
If you are,
don't speak of it to me.
I suppose this fine young man expects to see me personally? He was coming tomorrow, replied Marjorie. She began to weep. He was coming tomorrow. Said the professor. He continued his pacing while Marjorie wept with her head bowed to the arm of the chair. His brow made the 3 dark vertical crevices well known to his students. Sometimes he glowered murderously at the photographs of ancient temples which adorned the walls. My poor child, he said once, as he paused near her. To think I never knew you were a fool. I have been deluding myself. It has been my fault as much as it has been yours. I will not readily forgive myself. The girl raised her face and looked at him. Finally, resolved to disregard the dishevelment wrought by tears, she presented a desperate front with her wet eyes and flushed cheeks. Her hair was disarrayed. I don't see why you can call me a fool, she said. The pause before this sentence had been so portentous of a wild and rebellious speech that the professor almost laughed now. But still the father for the first time knew that he was being undauntedly faced by his child in his own library, in the presence of 372 pages of the book that was to be his masterpiece. At the back of his mind, he felt a great awe, as if his own youthful spirit had come from the past and challenged him with a glance. For a moment, he was almost a defeated man. He dropped into a chair. Does your mother know of this? He asked mournfully.
Yes,
replied the girl. She knows. She has been trying to make me give up Rufus. Rufus, cried the professor, rejuvenated by anger. Well, his name is Rufus, said the girl. But please don't call him so before me, said the father with icy dignity. I do not recognize him as being named Rufus. That is a contention of yours which does not arouse my interest. I know him very well as a gambler and a drunkard. And if, incidentally, he is named Rufus, I fail to see any importance to it. He is not a gambler, and he is not a drunkard,
she said.
He drinks heavily, that is well known. He gambles. He plays cards for money more than he possesses, at least he did when he was in college. You said you liked him when he was in college. So I did, answered the professor sharply. I often find myself liking that kind of a boy in college. Don't I know them, those lads with their beer and their poker games in the dead of the night with a towel hung over the keyhole? Their habits are often vicious enough, but something remains in them through it all, and they may go away and do great things. This happens.
We know it.
It happens with confusing insistence. It destroys Theo, Rise. There isn't much to say about it. And sometimes we like this kind of a boy better than we do the others. For my part, one know of many a pure, pious and fine-minded student that I have positively loathed from a personal point of view.
But,
he added, this Rufus Coleman, his life in college and his life since, go to prove how often we get off the track. There is no gauge of collegiate conduct whatever, until we can get evidence of the man's work in the world. Your precious scoundrel's evidence is now all in. and he is a failure, or worse. You are not habitually so fierce in judging people, said the girl. I would be if they all wanted to marry my daughter, rejoined the professor. Rather than let that man make love to you or even be within a short railway journey of you. I'll cart you off to Europe this winter and keep you there until you forget. If you persist in this silly fancy, I shall at once become medieval. Marjorie had evidently recovered much of her composure.
Yes.
Father, new climates are always supposed to cure one, she remarked with a kind of lightness. It isn't so much the old expedient, said the professor musingly, as it is that I would be afraid to leave you here with no protection against that drinking gambler and gambling drunkard. Father, I have to ask you not to use such terms in speaking of the man that I shall marry. There was a silence. To all intents, the professor remained unmoved. He smote the tips of his fingers thoughtfully together. Yes, he observed. That sounds reasonable from your standpoint. His eyes studied her face in a long and steady glance. He arose and went into the hall. When he returned, he wore his hat and great coat. He took a book and some papers from the table and went away. Marjorie walked slowly through the halls and up to her room. From a window, she could see her father making his way across the campus laboriously against the wind and whirling snow. She watched it, this little black figure, bent forward, patient, steadfast. It was an inferior fact that her father was one of the famous scholars of the generation. To her, he was now a little old man facing the wintry winds. Recollect. ING herself and Rufus Coleman. She began to weep again, wailing amid the ruins of her tumbled hopes. Her skies had turned to paper, and her trees were mere bits of green sponge. But amid all this woe appeared the little black image of her father, making its way against the storm. Chapter 2. In a high-walled corridor of one of the college buildings, a crowd of students waited amid jostlings and a loud buzz of talk. Suddenly a huge pair of doors flew open, and a wedge of young men inserted itself boisterously and deeply into the throng. There was a great scuffle attended by a general banging of books upon heads. The two lower classes engaged in Herculean play, while members of the two higher classes, standing aloof, devoted themselves strictly to the encouragement of whichever party for a moment lost ground or heart. This was in order to prolong the conflict. The combat, waged in the desperation of proudest youth, waxed hot and hotter. The wedge had been instantly smitten into a kind of block of men. It had crumpled into an irregular square, and on three sides it was now assailed with remarkable ferocity. It was a matter of wall meet wall in terrific rushes, during which lads could feel their very hearts, leaving them in the compress of friends and foes. They on the outskirts upheld the honor of their classes by squeezing into paper thickness the lungs of those of their fellows who formed the center of the melee. In some way it resembled a panic at a theater. The first lance-like attack of the sophomores had been formidable, but the freshmen, outnumbering their enemies and smarting from continual sophomoric oppression, had swarmed to the front like drilled collegians and given the arrogant foe the first serious check of the year. Therefore the tall Gothic windows which lined one side of the corridor looked down upon as incomprehensible and enjoyable a tumult as could mark the steps of advanced education. The seniors and juniors cheered themselves ill, long freed from the joy of such meetings. Their only means for this kind of recreation was to involve the lower classes, and they had never seen the victims fall to with such vigor and courage. Bits of printed leaves, torn notebooks, dismantled collars and cravats, all floated to the floor beneath the feet of the warring hordes. There were no blows. It was a battle of pressure. It was a deadly pushing where the leaders on either side often suffered the most cruel and sickening agony, caught thus between phalanxes of shoulders with friend as well as foe contributing to the pain. Charge after charge of freshmen beat upon the now compact and organized sophomores. Then, finally, the rock began to give slow way. A roar came from the freshmen, and they hurled themselves in a frenzy upon their betters. To be under the gaze of the juniors and seniors is to be in sight of all men. And so the sophomores at this important moment labored with the desperation of the half, doomed to stem the terrible freshmen. In the kind of game, it was the time when bad tempers came strongly to the front, and in many sophomores' minds a thought arose of the incomparable insolence of the freshmen. A blow was struck. An infuriated sophomore had swung an arm high and smote a freshman, although it had seemed that no greater noise could be made by the given numbers. The din that succeeded this manifestation surpassed everything. The juniors and seniors immediately set up an angry howl. These veteran classes projected themselves into the middle of the fight, buffeting everybody with small thought as to merit. This method of bringing peace was as militant as a landslide, but they had much trouble before they could separate the central clump of antagonists into its parts. A score of freshmen had cried out. It was Coke. Coke punched him.
Coke.
A dozen of them were tempestuously endeavoring to register their protest against fisticuffs by means of an introduction of more fisticuffs. The upperclassmen were swift, harsh, and hard.
Come. Now.
Freshies.
Quit it.
Get back. Get back. Do I hear? With a wrench of muscles they forced themselves in front of Coke, who was being blindly defended by his classmates from intensely earnest attacks by outraged freshmen. These meetings between the lower classes at the door of a recitation room were accounted quite comfortable and idle affairs. And a blow delivered openly and in hatred fractured a sharply defined rule of conduct. The corridor was in a hubbub. Many seniors and juniors, bursting from old and iron discipline, wildly clamored that some freshmen should be given the privilege of a single encounter with Coke. The freshmen themselves were frantic. They besieged the tight and dauntless circle of men that encompassed Coke. None dared confront the seniors openly, but by headlong rushes at auspicious moments they tried to come to quarters with the rings of dark-browed sophomores. It was no longer a festival, a game. It was a riot.
Coke.
Wild-eyed, pallid with fury, a ribbon of blood on his chin, swayed in the middle of the mob of his classmates. Comrades who waived the ethics of the blow under the circumstance of being obliged as a corps to stand against the scorn of the whole college, as well as against the tremendous assaults of the freshmen. Shamed by their own man, but knowing full well the right time and the wrong time for a palaver of regret and disavowal, this battalion struggled in the desperation of despair. Once they were upon the verge of making unholy campaign against the interfering seniors. This fiery impertinence was the measure of their state. It was a critical moment in the play of the college. 4 or 5 defeats from the sophomores during the fall had taught the freshmen much. They had learned the comparative measurements, and they knew now that their prowess was ripe to enable them to amply revenge what was, according to their standards, an execrable deed by a man who had not the virtue to play the rough game, but was obliged to resort to uncommon methods. In short, the freshmen were almost out of control, and the sophomores, debased but defiant, were quite out of control. The senior and junior classes, which, in American colleges dictate in these affrays, found their dignity toppling, and in consequence there was a sudden oncome of the entire force of upperclassmen football players naturally in advance. All distinctions were dissolved at once in a general fracas. The stiff and still Gothic windows surveyed a scene of dire carnage. Suddenly a voice rang brazenly through the tumult. It was not loud, but it was different. Gentlemen, gentlemen. Instantly there was a remarkable number of haltings, abrupt replacements, quick changes. Professor Wainwright stood at the door of his recitation room, looking into the eyes of each member of the mob of 300. SSH,
said the mob.
SSH.
Quit.
Stop. It's the ambassador. Stop. He had once been minister to Austro-Hungary, and forever now to the students of the college his name was ambassador. He stepped into the corridor, and they cleared for him a little respectful zone of floor. He looked about him coldly. It seems quite a general dishevelment. The sophomores display an energy in the halls which I do not detect in the classroom. A feeble murmur of appreciation arose from the outskirts of the throng. While he had been speaking, several remote groups of battling men had been violently signaled and suppressed by other students. The professor gazed into terraces of faces that were still inflamed. "I needn't say that I am surprised," he remarked in the accepted rhetoric of his kind. He added musingly, "There seems to be a great deal of torn linen. Who is the young gentleman with blood on his chin?" The throng moved restlessly. A manful silence, such as might be in the tombs of stern and honorable knights, fell upon the shadowed corridor. The subdued rustling had fainted to nothing. Then, out of the crowd, Coke, pale and desperate, delivered himself.
"Oh,
"Mr. Coke," said the professor, "I would be glad if you would tell the gentlemen they may retire to their dormitories." He waited while the students passed out to the campus. The professor returned to his room for some books, and then began his own march across the snowy campus. The wind twisted his coattails fantastically, and he was obliged to keep one hand firmly on the top of his hat. When he arrived home, he met his wife in the hall. "Look here, Mary,"
he cried.
She followed him into the library. "Look here,"
he said.
"What is this all about? Marjorie tells me she wants to marry Rufus Coleman." Mrs. Wainwright was a fat woman who was said to pride herself upon being very wise and, if necessary,
sly.
In addition, she laughed continually in an inexplicably personal way, which apparently made everybody who heard her feel offended. Mrs. Wainwright laughed. "Well," said the professor, bristling, "what do you mean by that?"
"Oh,
"Harris," she replied.
oh,
"Harris." The professor straightened in his chair. "I do not see any illumination in those remarks. Mary, I understand from Marjorie's manner that she is bent upon marrying Rufus Coleman. She said you knew of it." "Why, of course I knew. It was as plain." "Plain," scoffed the professor. "Plain.
Why,
Of course," she cried. "I knew it all along." There was nothing in her tone which proved that she admired the event itself. She was evidently carried away by the triumph of her penetration. "I knew it all along," she added, nodding. The professor looked at her affectionately. "You knew it all along.
Then,
Mary, why didn't you tell me, dear?" "Because you ought to have known it," she answered blatantly. The professor was glaring. Finally, he spoke in tones of grim reproach. "Mary, whenever you happen to know anything,
dear,
it seems only a matter of partial recompense that you should tell me." The wife had been taught in a terrible school that she should never invent any inexpensive retorts concerning bookworms, and so she yawned at once. "Really, Harris, really? I didn't suppose the affair was serious. You could have knocked me down with a feather. Of course he has been here very often. But then Marjorie gets a great deal of attention.